All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Ben Hovland and I'm chairman of the Election Assistance Commission. Today's video chat is taking place at a unique time in our nation's history. For election administrators, the novel coronavirus and COVID-19 have created an environment that demands tough choices regarding the safety of voters, election workers, and their staff. The EAC is working to provide information and resources for election officials by coordinating with state, local, and federal partners and offering whatever support we can at the federal level to help state and local officials administer safe, secure, accessible, and accurate elections. As part of that, we've organized this video where we're fortunate to be joined by three amazing election officials. Kim Wyman is the Secretary of State of Washington. Secretary Wyman is Washington's 15th Secretary of State. First elected in 2012, she's serving in her second term. Prior to being elected Secretary of State, Secretary Wyman served as the Thurston County Elections Director for nearly a decade and was elected Thurston County Auditor, which is the local election official in Washington, from 2001 to 2013. Neal Kelley is the Registrar of Voters of Orange County, California. That is the 5th largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, serving more than 1.5 million registered voters. He joined the county as the Chief Deputy Registrar of Voters in May 2004 and was appointed Registrar of Voters in April of 2006. And also we have Ricky Hatch, who is the County Clerk Auditor of Weber County, Utah. Ricky was elected in 2010. Prior to being elected, he worked as a CPA and an IT security and control consultant. This group is particularly equipped to address some of the challenges associated with increasing vote by mail because they have all served as election officials during the transition from a more traditional polling place focused elections to a mail-driven election process. And so I welcome you all and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to just jump right into it. I should have clicked these along earlier, but for those that are watching this, enjoy our guests. And so we're going to just start off with a question. As a potential response to COVID-19 and to keep our voters safe, what is the first thing an election office should examine when determining the feasibility of increasing their vote by mail capacity? Secretary Wyman, if you could kick us off there.
You know, I would start with looking first at what percentage of your voters right now are doing, you know, an ongoing or permanent absentee ballot if you're a poll site state. And I think the higher that percentage is, and for our state, we saw when you hit 60%, you were really a vote by mail state because you were running 2 concurrent elections every time. If you are well under that threshold, however, I think that the leap to complete vote by mail or really high absentees is going to be much more challenging. And what you really need to focus on then is what your not only capacity is, but what resources you have available right now. And particularly looking at facilities that are going to need to be moved to a more centralized type of processing. Whereas if you're a polling place voting system, you are probably very decentralized in how you are handling your absentee ballots. Do you have enough physical space to house the number of workers you're going to need to process ballots? Do you have enough high-speed machines to deal with the throughput of those centralized ballot counting processes? And then what is your window of time to process those ballots after Election Day when the bulk of your ballots will come in?
Thank you, Secretary Wyman. Neal, would you add anything to that?
I would, and one of the things that I would look at as well are the demographics of your community. You know, we're very diverse here in Orange County, and we have a very large Latino population as well as Asian American, and they vote very differently in terms of what their preferences are. For instance, Latino voters have traditionally voted more in person versus Asian American voters voting much more heavily by mail. And so those are challenges, and just in terms of communicating to those community groups and those communities about moving to vote by mail and what that means and changing habits can be very difficult. The other thing that I would add is the printers in your market. It may sound simple, but what certified printers are located nearby and what capacity do they have. There are many certified printers around the country, but they might not even have the capacity to handle additional vote-by-mail printing. So just two challenges I would throw out at the beginning.
And Ricky?
Yeah, I would, Neal, you stole my thunder.
Sorry.
Especially if you're a smaller county, if you've got, you don't already have a good relationship with a printer who does elections, you need to really find someone. A printer is one thing, a printer who can handle elections is another. That's, you got to make sure you get the right ballot with the right voter, which is crucial when you're processing thousands of envelopes. The only other thing I'd say is, especially if you're a state that validates signatures, you have to check the quality of the signatures that you have online, because if you haven't had to worry about those in the past, you might be in for a surprise when you see a whole bunch of really blurry or sometimes non-existent signatures that you're going to have to compare to the voter signatures.
Right, so that increase in volume. So my takeaway there was if you have an existing mail vendor, to check with them about their capacity, and if you don't, you're going to want to look for one. Would you all say that's right?
Absolutely.
And fast.
Mhm.
All right. So as administrators who have overseen the transitions from more traditional election day voting model to a vote-by-mail driven process, what are some of the significant lessons learned that may help your colleagues across the country?
I'm gonna let somebody else go first because I don't want to take all their thunder.
Let's go reverse order, Ricky. You're on deck.
All right. My thought is, first off, realize if you haven't done a lot, you're going to get a lot of returned mail, a pretty high percentage. So I would recommend you do a mailing first, even if it's just a postcard. Industry average is about 10% you're going to get back, but do a mailer and that will help clean out. You'll have a lot of corrections to make, but it'll help you clean out and maintain your list. If you can do a NCOA, National Change of Address list, or do CAS certification, sometimes your print vendor will do that for you. But I would recommend you do that soon. And I'd recommend you visit someone who has done vote by mail for quite a while and check out their processes and their controls. There's so much you can learn that's just not obvious until you've actually gone through it. So those are my two recommendations.
Thank you. Neal?
Yeah, I would very much focus on communication, and that's a lesson learned over the years with my office. Voters that have a clear ballot design and plain language instructions are much more likely to feel confidence in the system and to trust putting that envelope back in the mail and delivering it back to the election official. You'd be surprised at how muddy some of that language can get from vote-by-mail ballots designs to the instructions, and it can cause confusion for voters, and that's the last thing we want, especially for voters that are not used to voting by mail. That's one of the first things they're going to look for. And then the other piece I would add, and this may sound simple, but is really important, is the I voted sticker. We started including an I voted sticker in our vote-by-mail ballots and saw an actual uptick in the number of polling place voters that decided to request a vote-by-mail ballot. And I would be surprised I would think you might find out that there's some voters that actually would go to the polling place just for that sticker, but liked it in the envelope themselves.
Thank you for that. Secretary Wyman?
I would say especially if you have an election coming up quickly, the first thing you need to do is contact your local postmaster. If you're in a county or if you're, a state level, you should check in with the postal person at the top of the state level too, to get information from them. You're going to need to get your envelopes not only printed, but you're going to have to do all of the compliance with the federal postal standards for the ballot or the envelope design, and you've got to make decisions about how you're going to mail the ballots back. The voter's going to put a stamp on it, or if you're going to prepay postage. All of those things are going to take time, and it's probably the thing that most people don't think about, like, is the weight of your ballots going to be under an ounce? So all of those things the post office can help you with right now and can help you tool up. And again, the less absentee ballots you deal with now, probably the more you need to really sit down and focus and look at your materials out of the gate to make sure that you are already, you're ready to be able to print for your mailing.
Thank you. So next up, you know, a lot of what you've talked about is obviously influenced by the technology that you have in place, or maybe the technology you can acquire. So what technological investments should an office consider if they're expecting a significant increase in vote by mail ballots? Neal, you want to start this one? I saw, I was in Orange County a few weeks ago and saw the impressive setup that you have. Obviously, you've made some of these investments and would be great to hear about that decision making.
Yeah, there's three key areas in there that I would start thinking about making investments to increase your capacity. And the first is automation on the inbound side as well as the outbound side. So when you're producing vote by mail packets, it's much easier to have an automated system to be able to do that. If you're a very small county, you may end up having to do that by hand, realizing that there are some counties around the country with just a few thousand voters. But there are also tabletop automation devices that you can use to simplify the process, and really at the end of the day, they're not that expensive when you're comparing it to the human labor that you might be using for inserting. And in a county like Orange County, where we're supporting 6 languages in addition to English, that becomes very important to make sure that the right ballots are going in the right packets with the right instructions in the right languages. That's really important. The second piece is automation on that sorting side and the inbound and outbound piece, so that you can get postal efficiencies like the secretary was talking about. Working with your post office and reducing your postage costs is very important, and you can do that with these automated devices to get the right zip code sort and to use full IMB barcoding will help reduce costs. And then finally, having a way to open the envelopes. Again, small counties might be using human labor to open those envelopes, but there are also very small tabletop devices that you can invest in that simplify that by slicing the envelope and quickly allowing you to open that and do it efficiently.
Thank you. Secretary Wyman?
Definitely everything Neal just said. And I think another thing to be looking at is just your physical facilities that you have available. And ideally, if you are going to have to just open an entirely new facility and you get to make it from scratch, you want to be looking at flow of the incoming ballots, sort of that path of the ballot processing from, you know, signature checking to opening those envelopes and then preparing those ballots for counting. But those, I think Neal is absolutely right. There are some really simple things you can invest in, like an envelope opener, that aren't a big fiscal investment, but really will make the efficiency of that processing go a lot faster.
Thank you. And Ricky, your Weber County is a little smaller than Orange County, so you know, would love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, and my number one item was a slicer. Our lives were so much better when we got that envelope slicer, and we loved it so much and saw such improvement. We bought a second one just in case the first one didn't work. You can get a really good fast one for just over $1,000, and I'm sure there are plenty that are under 1,000 that aren't quite as fast. One thing I'd recommend is you test it with ballots inside the envelopes before, so you don't end up slicing your ballots. That you do a batch of 50 and all of a sudden you've got 50 ballots you have to remake, and that's a time-intensive process. Maybe barcode scanners. We record vote history by scanning a barcode on the outside of the envelope. That's helpful, and those are not very expensive either. And one non-technical piece is I actually, when we first went to vote by mail, I was running to the print shops around the county asking for empty boxes that we could store our ballots in and the envelopes in after the fact. And we had to scrounge up a whole bunch of boxes so that we had a good way to store those ballots.
That's great. Thank you all. What are the timeline issues that an election office can or should expect when considering the move to vote by mail or increasing vote by mail capacity? Again, I know that Secretary Wyman, we were recently in a conversation where you talked about the years-long process for Washington to scale up. Know that for a lot of folks right now, they're in a situation where they don't have that time. But the reality is there are timelines and pieces of this that you just can't skip. So to the degree that you could talk about that and what people should expect as they try to make this transition, or really it's just anticipating, frankly, an increased demand by their voters that they can expect this year.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the key things is if you try to do anything, first of all, let me back up. Depending on what your state's laws are in terms of requesting an absentee, if you have anything that's going to require the voter to send you a request back in writing or something like that, that people are going to have to process the incoming sheets for, that's really time consuming. So if you can automate that, put a barcode on it or something that will help the counties or your local election officials process that, that would be first and foremost. But I think I'm going to focus on the ballot return side, because one of the timeline pieces people don't think about is the flow of the ballots coming back to you and what your certification windows are. So in our state, we mail out ballots 18 days prior to election. Those ballots in the 18 days going into election day come in a pretty good, like 10% of them come back in that first day or two. Then it's a pretty steady flow until election day. But half of our ballots historically we see come in by the Friday before election day, which means half of the ballots that we're going to end up counting come in election week. And it depends on when your cutoff is going to be. Our state is a postmark for the return ballots. So as long as it's postmarked by election day, we can count it. So we get half of our ballots in Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of election week. And so you have to factor that into your processing and really do the math. Look at your trends of like previous elections on the amount of ballots that you receive back and project out how many you're going to need to process when half of your ballots are coming in election week. And will you have time in your certification window? In Washington for a special election, we have 10 days for a special election, 15 days for a primary, and 20 days for a general election on the backside of the election to certify. And that's just for the counties. The state still has a few days after that. So if you have a tight certification window, I would suggest trying to get that extended.
That's a great point. Thank you. Neal?
Yeah, I think the secretary made some really good points, and I would just add to that, you know, here in California, we just went under a stay-at-home order from the governor, and there's a lot of talk at the legislative level about what are we going to do in November. And November is just 9 months away. And if you were going to make some significant increases in capacity in your state, you need at least 9 to 12 months to do that. And so time is of the essence right now for people to start thinking about that. At a minimum, and I went back and looked at some contracts before we started this meeting, it took us about 10 months. So that's right on that window to be able to get a new piece in place and to have the integration done. The software integration between your election management system and your voter registration database is something that is critical and needs some time to work through. And in some cases, that can stall your plans as well. Even if you can get the equipment in and it's not back ordered, you might have that integration piece that stalls it down. So thinking about just that layout and how you would put that equipment in, a minimum of 9 to 12 months.
Thank you. Ricky, any timeline flags that you would point out?
I think you have to be sure to plan for your extract that's going to go out to your printer. You usually have to send that 6 to 8 weeks before the election, and you also should be doing your logic and accuracy tests at that time as well. So all of that scoots forward just a little bit. The other thing we need to consider, especially for November, is the surge in voter registrations that you're going to have to process simultaneously. And if you're on all by mail, that deadline again shoots because you've got to be able to get the ballot out to them in time that they can return it. Now, hopefully Facebook will play nice and let us know when they're going to do a big surge, but you're going to have the Taylor Swifts who tweet something like get registered today and poof, got thousands of new voters that you have to register. At the same time, you're processing ballots or preparing for polling places. So just be prepared for the voter registration service surge and know that those have to be taken care of really quickly in order to get the ballots out in time.
Right, so if you're getting a simultaneous registration and an absentee ballot request right at your registration deadline, your window to get a ballot out the door is cut down substantially.
Yeah.
Particularly depending on your state's registration deadline. All great points, thank you. Control here, there we go. What resources or recruitment efforts must an election office consider with an increased focus on vote by mail? You know, I think specifically I've heard some of you talk at different times. The reality is there are other pieces of the puzzle that have to be considered, other staffing challenges. Secretary Wyman, you mentioned centralization of some of your functions earlier, but to split this up again equitably, why don't we start with Ricky?
You bet. I think the first thing you have to do is figure out where your bottlenecks are going to be and create a workflow design that eliminates those. The theory of constraints really comes into play when you're dealing with thousands of ballots, or even just two of you dealing with hundreds of ballots. And constantly look for ways to improve that. I ask my other county departments to come in and help when we're doing peeling tabs or slicing envelopes or doing what you kind of call grunt work. The other elected officials in their departments they actually like coming in. It's kind of a fun, kind of a light, fun atmosphere, and that really helps because, well, first off, you don't have to pay them. Secondly, there are people who already understand government and the requirements and rules that we have to live under. So that helps quite a bit. And then I think my last thing is I'd say test your scanners. Test what the speed and capacity is, how many you can process in an hour, and then project your return rate and see what that's going to look like. See if you're going to have the staffing and time to be able to process everything.
Those are great thoughts. Neal, do you have thoughts there on how to focus resources or recruitment efforts?
I do. And 5 areas is what I would focus on. The first would be signature verification and the teams and the folks that are available to do that, and the training that you might have to put in place in order to increase that capacity. We're able to do 4 signatures across the screen at a time with about 50 individuals, and you're going through that volume at very high speed. But smaller counties have to think about how they would train those individuals to be able to do that signature comparison. The other is, and I know that Secretary Wyman and I deal with this in our states, and Dropbox considerations. The infrastructure of putting in Dropboxes and increasing the ability for voters to have different locations to drop off that vote by mail ballot, if your state allows that, is something that you have to consider. I will tell you that's one of the hardest lessons I learned in the last year, was standing up that infrastructure for Dropboxes, and it takes time and resources to do that. The other is technical support. I talked about that data integration a little bit between your automation piece and your election management system. That's very important to have that support, not only from your vendors, but from folks that might be in your IT department in your county or within your shop itself. And then finally, the sorting pieces. One of the things that I found is voters we see an increase in confidence levels from the voters when they can track their ballot from start to finish. So from the time you send it out till the time it comes back in, if you have that capability from a data standpoint to give them that view on their ballot, it's very important. But the lesson learned, again, this year for me was when you're sorting down to that granular level, it slows that piece down. And so you have to make those considerations and those decisions up front as to how much you're going to allow a voter to see what kind of data they have on their ballot. So for instance, what Dropbox number it is takes a lot more time to sort than if you just said it's in the mail. So a couple of considerations.
Thank you for that. And Secretary Wyman?
One of the things I think that's tough to plan if you've not done this before, but there are plenty of counties around the state or jurisdictions around the country that you could ask for relevance. But let me give you an example of one of our larger, but kind of the mid-range of one of our counties in our state is Pierce County, where Loria Gino used to work. When she geared up for an election, 60 days before the election, she was hiring 500 workers, extra help workers for the 500,000 ballots that registered voters they had in Pierce County. And those workers would start with doing the UOCAVA mail out and then the big mail out for all of the 500,000 voters. And they would work straight through election day and then in the certification period afterwards. And she said in a presidential year, that operation would run 24/7 Monday through Friday. So it goes back to exactly the points you just heard, where you have to start looking at your throughput and where those bottlenecks are going to occur, particularly in how fast you can run ballots through whatever equipment you need to run them through. And then the other thing is, remember that when ballots are sitting on somebody's counter and they have a lot of time to vote, voters get really creative. More so at the polls, and they will do things that you can't even contemplate right now, which is going to result in duplication. And this is one of those areas that you really have to plan for. I would say anticipate 1 in 10 of your ballots is going to need to be duplicated. And I'm kind of pulling that out of the air, but we would see about 10% of our ballots need duplication. Those require boards of teams of 2. They go through, they make the duplicate ballot, and then you switch them, and you need to kind of keep that balance and really open so people can watch that part of the process. And that is one of those time-consuming, very slow, manual or labor-intensive processes. And you need to make sure you have enough printed ballot materials to be able to do that duplication if you're in an optical scan environment. Digital scan's a little different, but again, be thinking about those duplication boards.
Thank you for that. All very important points. What other considerations should election offices take into account when transitioning to or increasing their usage of vote by mail? Obviously, we've covered a lot of specifics here, but want to give you sort of a free-for-all for the things that I've missed or other insights that you all undoubtedly are able to share. Secretary Wyman, you want to kick us off here?
Oh, sure. I think if I look back to 1993, when our state allowed counties to do permanent absentee voting and then also conduct some elections by mail, the 2 single biggest complaints voters had, and they were very vocal about it, very willing to share their opinions, is 1, they viewed the stamp as a poll tax on the ballot return envelope, and 2, I don't know about your state and how the ballot is designed and the envelope is designed for the return. If the voter's signature is on the outside envelope, they really focus on that. And we just saw it in our presidential primary where voters had to pick a party publicly, and our voters don't like to do that. So I caution you. All right, on one hand, I encourage you to consider drop boxes, because this is something that kind of just alleviates it. It's the weirdest dynamic. People will drive 50 miles out of their way to put their ballot in a drop box to avoid putting a stamp on it. And they're happy because their postman can't see their signature. But as Neal said, these are really, really labor-intensive, expensive things to maintain during the voting period, because you have to send people out in teams of 2 to pick up the daily ballots, and you have to have people on site election night at 8 o'clock or whenever your polls close to lock them all simultaneously. So it's an expensive venture, but it does really reduce the amount of complaints you'll get about poll taxes and signatures being viewable.
Thank you. Neal?
Yeah, I would add 2 things. One of the things that happens, I think, when you increase vote by mail usage is the disability community is one of the areas that we certainly don't want to lose sight of. And increasing your ability to reach out to those voters is really important. For instance, having a remote accessible vote by mail system in place, if you're going to expand vote by mail usage tremendously, is really important so that those voters have access to a system if they are not able to vote independently and privately on a vote by mail ballot. And the other piece of that is thinking about how you could reduce the number of rejected signatures on your vote by mail ballots. You will see, and to the Secretary's point about the duplication piece, the other is you've got a lot of voters that forget to sign their ballot, or a lot of voters that may use a credit card signature on that and it doesn't match the voter registration signature on file. And so you can use graphics and unique instructions inside of the vote by mail ballot to help reduce the numbers of rejects that you get. And when we did something similar to that, we were able to reduce the number of people that did not sign the ballot by about 10%. And when you're talking about sending out 1.6 million ballots, that really does help quite a bit.
That's great. Thank you. Ricky?
Voters don't like change. And when we moved to using touchscreen machines, there was an outcry and upset. And then when we moved to vote by mail, those same people that hated the machines now they wanted their machines and they hated the paper. So yeah, I would recommend you educate your voters early, especially educate your candidates and your political parties and your advocacy groups. Bring them into your office, show them your processes and show them your controls long before the election happens. They are always impressed when they come in and can walk through and you say, well, here's how I do this. And we always say, you can come in and observe this anytime. And I encourage you to think like a crook. try to look for holes in the system. Try to figure out how to cheat the system, because we want to plug them. And every time they get done with the tour and they say, "I am so glad you showed us this. I feel so much more confident in the process." And then they can go out and talk to their party constituents or their advocacy folks. And then what I would recommend is survey your voters after and see how it worked for them, because that can help you on the legislative front if laws have to be changed to make this a more permanent change, or if it's decided that voters don't like it. The surveys really do help.
Great points, thank you. And so as we wrap this up, you know, we've obviously hit a lot of different areas of this process, and again, you know, what we're focusing on here is a situation where your colleagues across the country are trying to get closer to a system like where you're at, or again, maybe it's just simply going from 10% to 15 or 20% vote by mail. But as we see those increases happen, if there are closing tips or recommendations or resources that you'd like to flag for people, we'd welcome that. Neal, I'll let you kick it off, and we'll move around a little bit here in order.
Thank you. I actually have just one simple piece of advice that worked for us pretty well in the last round of elections, and that is using communication such as vote at home, because it changes the dynamic from that kind of mail piece to more of a better experience for the voter to take their time, to have that ballot around for a little bit of time and not have to rush it. And as we saw in the primaries recently, you know, candidates were dropping out and things were happening up until the last weekend before Election Day. You can still hang on to that ballot, vote it on Election Day, and then return it directly to a drop box or in the mail, depending on your state law. So the idea of convenience and simplicity, I think, is much better than saying this is a piece of mail. But that's just what we found here.
Thank you, and certainly do want to flag on that. You know, it is important for people to keep in mind if they're a postmark state or a received ballot state, you know, obviously, and educate their voters about that, because it will make a difference on what is or what is not able to be counted. Ricky, you want to?
Yeah, one thing I'd say is you're not alone. You have a tremendous community of election officials who are eager to help and share knowledge. The EAC is a great example. You have associations like IGO, the Election Center, NACO, the Center for Technology and Civic Design, Center for Civic Design. So it's all of them have tons of resources online, and you pick up a phone and call of your fellow election officials in the state or outside of states. You'll find a very willing community who's there to support you and help however we can.
Thank you for those comments, Ricky. And actually, this is the first in a series of these videos that we're going to do, but we're also planning to accompany them with some of the resources that you all have mentioned. And so look for those. Secretary Wyman, you want to close us out here?
Yes, I think the tip I would give is particularly for my peers across the country that are looking at this from a statewide level, really try to get your counties or your local election officials to be very consistent in how they adopt their vote by mail standards. So things to think about, for example, I think what Neal was touching on, when you are talking about curing signatures, so the voter signature doesn't match the one on file or they forget to sign it, what's your plan? Are you going to allow those voters to have a second chance and come in and sign that envelope or sign that oath and make sure it's valid? And if you do, you want to make sure it's fair and accessible to everyone. And the secondary question is, will you allow them to do that after Election Day? Because what you will see is campaigns will come in and ask for the list of people's signatures that don't match, and they will go out and actively try to get those cure forms in. And so if you're going to have that going on, you're going to want your local elected officials to even the playing field and contact all of those voters, which again is another time-intensive process of matching those up and processing them. And I think that the last thing would be making sure that when the adjudication is happening and you have questions about voter intent, that every single jurisdiction in your state, counties, townships, whatever they are looking at ballots the same way, and you have that same voter intent application, no matter if it's a big county or small county. And we have a voter intent manual that our counties have and their canvassing boards use every single election for when it comes down to, is this a vote? Or is this just a mark? And they are all doing it consistently. So if you get into a recount and you end up in court, you have something that shows that every county in the state was acting the same way.
Great tips. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that you all are in the middle of certifying elections, planning elections. You are in the middle of your own elections. And so really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and to walk through and share these thoughts and your expertise. Anything that you want to send our way, we are compiling resources for the clearinghouse and for our page here. Happy to add that. And certainly anyone who is watching this, if you have additional needs or if you have resources that you want to share with the community, please feel free to reach out to the Election Assistance Commission and we'll look into making those available. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.